right, welcome to the show. This is Brent, your host of the LJS podcast. And on today's episode 19, we're actually continuing our conversation from last week with internationally renowned jazz guitarist Larry Koonse. Larry joined us all the way from Los Angeles, California to talk about his career, to talk about jazz, to talk about music, and a host of other things. But before we get started, just want to say that all the music on today's show is by our guest, Larry Koonse. It's from his latest album, Conversations. That's a duo recording with pianist David Roitstein. So if you like this music, you want to check it out a little further, head on over to iTunes or Amazon.com. You can purchase that album there. And remember that if you get value at today's podcast, consider adding value back. This podcast, it's 100% funded and produced by listeners like you. So if you do get some value and you're listening on the website, you can click the support button below. And if you're not on the website, you can go to learnjazzstandards.com/support. We also have a lot of really cool rewards for donating on a monthly or annual basis. So be sure to check that out there. Okay, and I just want to thank my good friend Peter Ruby, who actually conducted this interview with Larry Koonse. So I just want to say thanks to Peter. He's a guitarist and he's a professional writer. He actually is a guest blogger for Learn Jazz Standards. So if you want to check out one of his latest pieces, go to learnjazzstandards.com and search for Does Talent Matter? It's a great piece. We'll also have that in the show notes below if you're on the website. All right, now if you haven't listened to part one of this interview, I highly encourage you to go back and do so. But without further ado, let's go ahead and continue where we left off with Peter and Larry.
I was talking to a friend of mine who's a terrific guitar player, just sort of generically about how you approach playing. You had this really interesting idea of a pie chart, which we can talk about in a second. But one of the things he said was, "Oh, I couldn't think about that while I'm playing. It's just instinctual for me." And I thought, well, we talked about the fact that it was, there's one thing to kind of analyze it, and there's another thing to kind of actually play on the gig. And obviously, you're not thinking analytically when you're playing in a setting. But how do you go about balancing thinking about what you're doing in a practice way to making it instinctual when you're actually playing?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a caveat here in that when I'm playing, it's not that thought processes aren't happening, because there are multiple levels of consciousness. So you can think of a specific set of pitches or some construct, a scale or whatever, and you can at the same time say, while I'm holding on to this notion that there's this construct, I'm playing something that's expressive. So I want the deepest parts of myself, the parts that feel the most connected with this, to sort of take precedence. So while I'm using this device, I'm fashioning it or emphasizing my sound. I'm emphasizing the space between notes. I'm emphasizing the way I'm shaping the sound, much in a way that a painter would, with a brush stroke on a canvas, say, I want this glob to be a little thicker here. There's a texture here. It's not just the technique; it's the sensual nature of it all. So that's the way I practice, basically. If I'm working with a specific notion, whatever it is, whatever technical aspect of playing, whether it's applying a scale, looking into a specific way of using passing tones, looking into a way of organizing wider intervals, whatever it is, I'm also thinking about those deeper parts of playing that have to do with feeling and expression. Mm-hmm. Those are always in play for me. For me, if those things aren't in play, then I don't feel connected to my instrument.
Would you talk a little bit about what you listened to as you matured as a player that shaped who you are? I remember hearing, I don't know whether I've sent them to you, but there's some tapes out there of you and Warren Marsh playing together in a quartet, sitting in various places in California, for example.
Yeah.
And, there are definitely aspects of other players that seem to have sort of been in your playing at that point, as it's true of all of us. George Benson, I get a little Kenny Burrell, I guess, Jim Hall. But, obviously as you evolved as a player, you found your own musical personality. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that musical personality has evolved.
That's a great question, Peter. When I hear recordings from that period when I was playing with Warren, I guess Warren passed away in '87, and I think I played with him for the last year of his life, basically, so '86 to '87. I hear a guitarist that sounds to my ear like Joe Pass. And it's a very close connection to Joe. And of course,
my first major influence, that record he created, For Django, was I was like 15 or 16, and I got the record, brought it home, and I spent all afternoon just listening over and over again to that one record.
That's interesting, Peter, because that one record was one of my big first influences too. There was something about, first of all, Joe was a virtuoso, and I just loved his time center, the way he articulated things, and so that was a huge influence. But at the same time, I didn't find myself being satisfied just with playing music from the American Songbook. I liked a lot of the music of ECM. And found myself being attracted to players that sort of worked outside the mold of being mainstream jazz players. And I think those sounds sort of became part became a part of how I operated. So classical music was in there. And when I think of players like Keith Jarrett, he seems to reflect that aesthetic. He's definitely a classically trained pianist who can improvise and sort of finds these ways to sort of bridge the gap between these two things. And I've also played with a lot of bands that have done that, with Billy Childs, who is definitely coming from sort of a 20th century classical mold as a composer and incorporating improvisation. Playing with players like I mentioned before, Luciana Souza and Tierney Sutton, who sort of comes from a classical sort of approach and bridging these things. I think also playing with a pianist named Otmar Ruiz, who's an incredible pianist from Venezuela who has this rhythmic he's basically just a rhythmic genius. It's incredible what he does. I still have a very small understanding of how he's able to pull off some of the stuff that he does. But working with all these eclectic musicians sort of affords you the opportunity to look at the music from different perspectives. And I see other players that are sort of just interested in straight ahead jazz, and that is their path, but that to me is not interesting. And I definitely I have a curiosity about music that falls outside the borders of just the American songbook.
What's interesting is that what you're describing and have described is this would lead one who hasn't heard you play yet to think of you as a somewhat esoteric player, but that's far from the truth. I mean, you really dig in. You have a strong, solid blues background. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about the fact that what's always attracted me to you as a teacher, that at least somebody that I get to talk to occasionally about music that straightens my ass out, is that you have this really interesting balance between this sort of slightly esoteric thinking about what you're doing, but this Wes Montgomery blues-based playing, hard swinging, which you haven't talked about very much, but is clearly kind of the basement of everything.
You sort of nail it, Peter. That's a very strong aspect of where I come from, and there's something about the infectious feeling of swinging and connecting with time that I feel is I don't feel it was always strong. I feel like I've really had to focus a lot of my energy and practice to solidifying that. But there's something that about connecting deeply with time and essentially when you're making that your emphasis and you're with players of like mind, you're sort of unified in that way, and it becomes something that connects you to these other players. It's something it's kind of fascinating. To me, it's like quantum physics. It's invisible. It's like the atoms have all these little parts that are connected by these alternating masses of energy. And I think time's like that. It's fascinating in that way, in that it is invisible, yet it's tangible, and you can connect with it. And that, to me, is the magical aspect of music. So there's something about time feel that I feel is elemental. It's got to be there.
Mm-hmm. Could we sort of get to that topic that I mentioned earlier, which is something that you and I've talked a lot about, which is what you understand by flow and how you practice it, and what it sort of how it shapes one's playing.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I talked about an earlier version of myself that was interested in, along with my peers, sort of working or fighting, I would say, fighting the metronome, and feeling that technique was about some mechanistic approach in which you could find through pure mechanics this way of being able to perform a passage and being able to sort of increase the metronomic tempo and progressively being able to play faster and more cleanly, and that model of working in that mechanistic way did not work for me ultimately, and it was during this period of my practice in which I sort of ratcheted up the amount of time that I was spending practicing in this way, and sort of finding myself getting further and further away from really truly feeling connected to the guitar and to music. And the byproducts of that period were a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. A lot of the that time was sort of characterized by this feeling of disconnection.
Yeah.
And I essentially set down the guitar and did not want to play it because I was so frustrated by my approach and its inability to yield results. I knew there was something wrong, and where I would internally, where I was coming from at that time, I realized that if I didn't change something, or if I didn't find a better way of operating, that I couldn't do this because there was just too much pain involved. I was going through too much self-hatred, too much the bad kind of self-criticism. and it was becoming increasingly difficult to live with myself and my and the inner life that existed in my psyche. So I set down the guitar and sort of let some of the frustration and anger that accumulated on a daily basis when I picked up the guitar subside. And then one day I became interested in playing again. I just saw the guitar in the stand. I think this was 2 months down the line. You know, and I thought, oh God, that would be kind of interesting to go over there and see what happens. And I was fortified because, you know, a lot of that angst and anxiety that I was feeling had subsided. And I picked up the guitar, and I remember I played an F scale. I played because there's something about that lowest fingered note, the F, that was really attractive to me. And I played it out of time, and the emphasis was to create a beautiful sound like those cellists that I described in my earlier experience playing with orchestras. And there was also this sort of connection to when I picked up the guitar when I was 6, when I didn't know what I was doing, and I strummed the strings and tactily felt what it was to feel flesh against the string. And there was some of that I guess you could say some of that energy involved in playing the guitar. And it was sort of an innocent energy in that way, not so laden with stuff that I had accumulated that was self-created. I played for about 5 minutes and was kind of astonished at how much I enjoyed it and how connected I felt. And there was no reinventing the wheel. It was just playing an F major scale. I remember through the first zone, that was a system that was created by this guitarist that I had studied with at USC, Duke Miller, that I mentioned earlier. He had the zone system, which consisted of a 5-fret expanse, and I played that F major scale in that zone, and it was so satisfying. And from that time on, the metronome sort of went back in the drawer. The notion of playing something and then attempting to play something quicker also went into the drawer. All that stuff sort of went by the wayside as I became more interested in producing a sound on the instrument that felt to me like I was sort of singing. Mm-hmm. And since that time, that's been my emphasis, and it's increased. You know, at that time, it increased gradually. The next day, I think I picked it up and played it for 10 minutes. Right. And now, honestly, if I have 4 hours in the course of a day, for me, that's a great joy to pick up the instrument, because there's something about feeling that connection with something that's separate from yourself, and sort of finding that little window of opportunity to sort of to connect with it and become one with it. There's something about that practice that to me is very attractive.
Something I came across the other day. A friend of mine did an interview with Peter Bernstein, and who I know you've recorded one track with, so you guys actually know each other and have met. And it's interesting.
It's a funny story about that track too, but I'll tell you later.
Well, but one of the things that Peter talked about was he said, jazz is strong personalities working together. And I thought that was a very interesting description of what happens when you sort of sit down and play.
That really is fascinating. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I totally understand what Peter's talking about, but those strong personalities can be reflected in different ways. Without mentioning specific people, I've played with, you know, some of the greatest technicians on the planet who are and not just technicians who understand music and the building blocks of music, and had the most unsatisfying experiences playing with these people. Strong personalities, with great time, with the ability to sort of technically be able to pull off anything that they internally will themselves to do. And yet, I have ended up having some of the worst musical experiences with these people. And these people are, you could say on one level, and, you know, again, without naming names, some of them are, you know, geniuses on one level. They're able to sort of, at will, conjure stuff that, from the perspective of what I'm hearing come out, the way it's coming out, I don't understand how they're able to conjure these musical moments. So, and on the other hand, you know, there are strong personalities who, it's, you know, words are really tricky. Strong personalities, to me, it's sort of, in a way, it connotates that someone is egotistical, you know, and it's all about me.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Peter meant that necessarily.
I think Peter did. No,
my sense is he was talking about somebody that's just, you know, like you in a way, you know, so steeped in playing,
right?
And the this is a weird way of putting it, but the culture of playing,
Right.
That, you know, you're beyond the kind of level that certainly most people listening to this are going to be at any one stage.
Gotcha.
You know, so it's like, well, it's who is this musical person? I mean, sort of go back a little bit to that pie chart idea you had, where you broke playing down into, you know, there's the chord tones and the harmony, which is 1/3,
right.
And then there's where you sit on the beat, which is basically your musical personality, and then there's the use of space,
right.
And those three things together, you know, one of which is overemphasized because it's kind of easier to focus on.
Right.
But it's that totality that kind of creates, you know, how you swing, how you sit, how you play with other people. And I think my sense is he was talking about
I think you're right, Peter, especially since, you know, I know where Peter comes from. Peter's one of my favorite guitarists on the planet. You know, he's just a beautiful musician and has a wonderful sense of, in his playing, of sort of giving, you know, as well as sort of diving in and taking advantage of whatever musical environment is present. He has this ability to support that is truly on the highest level. So, you know, when I hear Peter, it's interesting, you know, when I hear players that come from the perspective that Peter does, and in a way, I think it's kind of rare in this world of virtuosos, because you can be a virtuoso and somehow not touch on deeper things, but Peter does, and he's a virtuoso too from my perspective. And when I hear Peter, I'm totally captivated by what he does, and it doesn't light up those base parts of myself that might be envious. Yet I can hear a virtuoso that's sort of empty and become envious. It's interesting how that works, how it lights up certain things, you know. And I think it's because he's when you talk about that pie graph, you know, I've used that in the past to describe a musician that I feel is sort of tapping into the deepest aspects of their ability, in that they're able to give up the notion that they are doing something, they are initiating something, instead of letting the moment sort of initiate something that comes from inside. And Peter has that. So, you know, when I see an artist that has that perspective, for me, it transports me and it brings me into that experience and into that level of consciousness.
I came across a quote which always, it kind of informed, you know, my life to a degree, and it was a quote from Art Blakey, who, you know, was one of the great players. And Art Blakey once said, "Talent is the speed with which you learn something." which I always it really spoke to me, that, because it emphasizes the work, but it doesn't mean that talent is some magical gift that somebody has touched.
Yeah.
With. It.
Yeah. It's interesting. I feel like I'm a slow learner. So when I'm learning a new piece of music, I take it very slowly. I meticulously finger everything. In fact, I just finished debuting all this music by this pianist that I mentioned earlier, Maru Ruiz. And the music was incredibly challenging. I really had not encountered music that was this challenging since grappling with the music of Billy Childs. So there was I had about a month, and I was in New Zealand at the time that I was beginning to learn this music, and the first process was basically where to locate it on the guitar, because it was real rangy. So it went from the low range to the high range, and so there was this real meticulous process of trying to absorb the music. And in fact, we had our first performance about a little less than a week ago. I don't feel like I really got there. It wasn't quite ready. There wasn't enough time for the music to germinate. So there is definitely this aspect for me of and I used to think of this as a disadvantage, but now I'm seeing it as maybe something that is not so. It's not so unfortunate that I'm a slow learner. In a way, it's caused me to sort of really have to look into what's beneath the surface, and to try to find out what are the deeper aspects of whatever stumbling blocks that I'm dealing with. And it's interesting. I think most of the stuff has to do with looking into the expressive aspects of the music. When I find how I want it to sound, how I would sing it, it sort of unlocks itself. The technical aspect of it unlocks itself. If I can connect with the sound and find some expressive quality, ultimately, after I've done all the meticulous work of fingering things, and I think the fingerings come about as a result of trying to unlock that expressive musical germ of the music. When I find that, the technique starts to disappear, the mechanical part, the mechanistic part.
So just to close up, because I know you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I greatly appreciate that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your latest recording, which is Conversations, which is a duo with a pianist, which is very much in there's a certain tradition which I guess was a tradition that was accidentally born by Jim Hall and Bill Evans. It was Undercurrents was the record.
That's right. Yeah.
Which I learned many years later was actually supposed to be a regular record date with a bass player and a drummer who just, for some reason or other, never turned up.
Really?
That's what I told. And so they just went ahead and started to play. And in fact, one of the signature tracks from that, which is My Funny Valentine, was apparently a sound check.
No kidding.
Those are the stories that I've heard. Of course, there's no guarantee they're actually true.
Well, with
it makes a certain
absolutely
sense.
With players like Jim Hall and Bill Evans, I mean, how can you miss? We're talking about when we're talking about earlier, we were talking about strong personalities. I guess you could say both of them have strong personalities, but they don't exert themselves in the fabric of the music. In other words, they're open to wherever the music leads them. They don't have an agenda going into it.
Right.
And you really get a sense of that. And the pianist that I recorded with, David Reutstein, has that quality of sort of being able to let the music sort of blossom in whatever direction it wants to go. He has that in spades. First of all, he's brilliant harmonically. He's beautiful touch, great sound. He's the head of the program at Cal Arts where I teach, and but more than that, he really truly plays from each musical moment. That becomes his emphasis. He's not an agenda-based player. He's not interested in playing a lot of notes. He's really coming from the perspective of trying to find how to make the music bloom from moment to moment. And David and I have presented a duo class, a class on duo playing, since I was first at Cal Arts. And so throughout the years, we logged all these hours, coming up with different material from year to year to perform for the students and to talk about the aesthetic of playing in a duo format, which we're both attracted to. And I think I'm attracted to it because it affords you the opportunity to have a direct conversation with another person. And I use this analogy a lot. If you're at a party and you're talking with 4 or 5 different people, which is essentially a quartet or a quintet, it's difficult. It's more difficult to scratch beneath the surface and really get to some substantive stuff. And in a duo format, it's sort of immediate. There's this flow of throwing out an idea and getting an immediate response that is attractive to me. So basically, this CD came out of that all those years that we had logged in putting together these classes. And so we wanted to play a few standards. There are a few standards on the project, but also reflect some of the original material that we've written and performed in the past. So that's what this CD represents, a collection of both those things.
Do you have any favorite tracks or tracks that you're particularly interested in obviously the whole record is something that you guys are happy with.
Well, interestingly enough, Peter, my favorite track on the recording involves no improvisation, and it's it's the tune by Jobim called Louisa, and it's written in 3. I think it's one of 2 tunes that he wrote that's in 3/4. And some people might listen to this track and think it's a bit sappy. It sounds maybe a little like interestingly enough, Jobim wrote this tune for a telenovela, which is a soap opera in Brazil. And it kind of sounds like soap opera music, but through the prism of somebody with the kind of melodic and harmonic sophistication that Jobim possessed. And that's my favorite track, Louisa. It's a very straightforward statement of the melody once through the tune. And there's something about the sound and the way that David and I are playing together that is really attractive to me.
Anyway, listen, Larry, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I truly appreciate it.
My pleasure, Peter. It's always great talking with you. I love your perspective, and you're a great listener, and you're very insightful in terms of where you go with a conversation.
Oh, shucks. Thank you.
All right, that's all for our show today. I want to thank again Peter and Larry for their great conversation, and I know I got a lot out of it. And if you got something out of it too, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment for us in the comment section below if you're on the website. And remember, Larry Koonse's album Conversations is available on iTunes and Amazon. Be sure to check that out. And if you got some value out of today's show, consider adding value back. If you're on the website, you can click the support button to leave us a one-time, monthly, or annual donation. We'd greatly appreciate your support. Next week, we're going to be coming out with the big episode 20 of the LJS podcast. We're looking forward to seeing you back then.
Thank you.